Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure and an honor to present Professor Mike Hulme to you today. It's also a challenge because I had to summarize executively on 2 pages of notes what I could possibly say about his tremendously interesting journey. As Zé Luís Cardoso said, Professor Mike Hulme is Professor of Climate and Culture. And those of you who will be most attentive will notice that there is a word missing in that. Change. And he's head of the Department of Geography at King's College. But he was also for, I believe, 25 years, if I'm correct, at University of East Anglia, where he was Professor of Climate Change. And he was also director as well as founder of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research. So the rest of my presentation of Professor Mike Hulme will negotiate the difference between his current title, which I believe you gave yourself, Professor of Climate and Culture, and Climate Change. In terms of education, Mike is a geographer, I'm delighted to say, and he has a geography degree from Durham. He also has a PhD on applied climatology from the University of Wales. And short of something to do, I believe, around the mid of the 2000s, he decided to take a diploma in history. He defines himself as a geographer by instinct, certainly by passion, definitively by training, and now by profession. But he also defines himself as an associated anthropologist. Now, I list this because I want you to note that we have here a speaker who has embraced at least 4 domains of knowledge and ways of knowing that are tremendously powerful together. And his lecture today is perhaps the sort of summing up of this very long and diverse journey. Mike Hulme has served the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the period of 1995 to 2001. He has been convening lead author of the scenarios chapter of the IPCC third assessment report, as well as lead author and review editor of several chapters of that same period. He's also been manager of the Data Distribution Center of the IPCC. In terms of publication record, I won't even try to list it, but I think it suffices to say that Mike Hulme is the 10th most cited author in the world in the field of climate change for the period from 1999 to 2009, and that's when he produced the book titled Why We Disagree with Climate Change, which The Economist in 2009 December quoted as one of the 4 most influential books in science and technology for that year. So I believe that the statistics are probably even more awesome today. Now, in terms of his research, the work of Mike Hulme has covered a very large range of aspects of climate change. The way knowledge is constructed has been a particular area of interest to him, especially in his work in relation, obviously, to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and his experience therein. He also looks and is interested in the representation of climate in media and in the interaction between climate change in terms of knowledge and the field of policy. That's Why We Disagree About Climate Change, which was published in 2009 by Cambridge University Press, was perhaps one of the milestones of those reflections. In this book, it engages with everything that characterizes us as human beings, the values, the beliefs, and the worldviews, and what makes it difficult for us to come to some agreement around such a complex area of problems. I can't really say one problem. He's interested in terms of the historical and the anthropological approach to the issue of climate change, both what can be done about climate change, but also what can climate change do for us. And here we come closer and closer to the area that brought him probably to King's College, to geography, to label himself as a professor of climate and culture, and to his latest book, which should be out in a month, by Sage, which is entitled Weathered, Cultures of Climate Change, and which the Eva Horn, who is from the Faculty of Philological and Cultural Studies at the University of Vienna, defined as a milestone for interdisciplinary climate research and a must-read for all scholars and students trying to understand how a human being in the world is a being in climate, which I thought was a very nice way of summarizing and introducing your lecture today for us, the cultural functions of climate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia, for those warm words of welcome, very generous words of welcome, and Professor Cardozo for the invitation to address this opening of the academic year here in the Institute of Social Science, the University of Lisbon. Very impressed with just the few hours I've been able to spend here this morning, hearing about the Institute, you all as scholars and researchers and academics in the Institute, and the breadth of work that you are undertaking. I don't think in the UK we do have anything that I can think of that is comparative to what you have here in the Institute. And so let me add my jealousy to those others who have also expressed admiration for what you are able to achieve and deliver here in Lisbon. So thank you for the chance to come and share my thoughts with you this afternoon. And again, the invitation from Professor Cardozo was a very generous one, basically to say I could come and talk about anything I wanted to. Which really, for me, professionally at least, has to revolve around climate. And this is the object of my professional life, starting from a student. Actually, before that, even at high school, I was taken with the weather and the way in which it impacted and influenced the ways and my pleasures of life as a boy. So it has to revolve around climate. But as Olivia has alluded, the way I've been thinking about climate over my professional career has changed and evolved quite considerably, just as much, one might say, as the climate itself has changed and evolved quite considerably. And of course that is an opening introduction, isn't it, into thinking about the role of the relationship that we have as individuals embedded in cultures, and our engagement with the physical properties and phenomena that the atmosphere delivers to us. This is a symbiotic, or what I sometimes refer to a dyadic relationship between the atmosphere and the human. So what I'm wanting to do in this talk, and I hope I can do a little bit of justice to the introduction that Olivia gave me, but also to the range of disciplines that you have here in the Institute, of anthropology, of history, of sociology, of social psychology, of political science, of geography, and maybe some more besides, history, and so on. So did you justice to this in thinking more deeply about not climate change, and I'll explain the reason why this, but the idea of climate itself. And I'm not an anthropologist, although I have sometimes described myself as an associated anthropologist. I certainly have learned a lot from anthropologists that I have found very insightful and very helpful. And anthropologists perhaps have come relatively recently to their engagement with the phenomenon of climate change, perhaps over the last 10 or 20 years, perhaps in particular. Certainly anthropologist Todd Sanders in the States refers to a circle now of critical climate change anthropologists who are seeking to understand this phenomenon of climate change through anthropological thought and method. And there has definitely been, in my own culture in the UK, a widening range of reflections on how British weather and climate interact with our cultural and historical life. These are a couple of examples. Just recently, in the last year, Nick Groom, a professor of English, with his book The Seasons, A Celebration of the English Year, looking at how British rural life over the last few hundred years have engaged with the experience of English weather. Or more recently, Alexandra Harris, through literary culture, in her book Weatherland, Writers and Artists Under English Skies, exploring the idea of weather through literature over the last 1,000 years in British historical culture. So we can see these widening entry points into understanding this relationship between weather and culture, certainly in the UK, and I suspect elsewhere as well. But the contemporary phenomenon of climate change, or more precisely, that's not supposed to happen, or more precisely the idea of anthropogenic climate change, the idea that changes in climate caused by human activities in the world, is an idea that is more recent than the idea of the weather. And we're familiar most particularly around this through the work of the IPCC, for example, under the United Nations umbrella. Over the last 25 years, this successive range of assessments, bringing together scientific knowledge, some social scientific knowledge around this idea of anthropogenic climate change, or the politics of climate change, of course, through the Paris Agreement most recently, which has now come into force. And again, we have 25 years of international political negotiations around the idea of climate change. So this is a more recent manifestation of our interest in climate. And indeed, this was the motivation why I wrote my book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, nearly a decade ago now, was to explore the deep-seated reasons why we do find it difficult to deal with this emergent phenomenon of climate change. And these disagreements are rooted in human values. The disagreements are not simply a function of deficient scientific understanding amongst our publics. No, the disagreements are rooted in human values about what we treasure, what we value, how we see agency in the world, how we see the responsibility of ourselves as humans to the non-human, to the divine, so on and so forth. But what I'm wanting to do in this talk is to focus more precisely on the idea of climate itself. And in that sense, this book that Olivia mentioned, Weathered, Cultures of Climate, which is coming out next month, is, in some sense, it's a prequel to my book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. In other words, what I'm trying to do in this new book is to dig more deeply into the idea of climate itself. Because actually, by digging into this idea of climate itself, I think we can see some of the underlying roots of the disagreements that we have about climate change. And in particular, we can see some of the powerful symbolic and cultural functions of the idea of climate as expressed historically and geographically around the world. So that's what I'm seeking to do in the talk this afternoon. Now, thinking of this idea of climate, certainly if we think of this in terms of Western intellectual history and tradition, there have been two dominant ways in which Western science has thought about the idea of climate. The standard definition of climate, for example, that the World Meteorological Organization would offer, and in fact it was a German geographer who first made this proposition back at the end of the 19th century, that we take 30 or 35 years of meteorological measurements in a particular place, average them together, and then we have a numerical, statistical description of the climate of a place. The climate here of central Lisbon, for example, captured in these thousands of individual meteorological measurements. Climate in this sense is quite an arbitrary construction. Why 30 or 35 years? Why not 3 or 300 or 3,000? Humans here are imposing a numerical order on the atmosphere. Time and space, in this definition, are quite artificially segmented. The measurements taken at this particular spot by these instruments measured over these particular periods of years. Weather, in this sense, is ordered through numbers. A slightly different way of thinking about climate has emerged in the last 30 years through the new paradigm of Earth system science, and this is captured very much by the way the IPCC has thought about climate. This is a more analytical and systemic approach. Climate understood as a mechanical system of moving parts and flows of energy, moisture and matter around the world, which is predictable on the basis of mathematical representations of these flows and their simulation in computer models. This global systemic view of climate, the Earth system, is one just of the last 30 years or so, and it's part of the rise of a globalized scientific endeavor, of pervasive instrumentation everywhere. The whole planet is now instrumented, and of international cooperative science. But these are two quite particular ways of thinking about climate, peculiar to Western tradition, longer or more recent in terms of scientific thinking. Climate is not always, or even today in the world, thought of in this way at all. There are much older and more diverse stories of what climate has meant. Thus, if we go to the etymology of the word climate, klimata, takes us back to classical Greece. Pythagoras' disciple, Parmenides, is credited with this idea of climate in the 6th century before the Common Era. And these early attempts at climatic classification by Herodotus and Ptolemy revealed that the Greeks were inhabiting the temperate zone of the eastern Mediterranean, which was a forgiving, sympathetic environment for the rise of classical culture, in contrast for the Greeks to the frigid and torrid klima of the north and the south, which were dangerous for human existence and certainly antithetical to cultural life. Here, for the Greeks, the idea of climate established fixed geographies of weather, place, and race. Or we could jump to the 19th century with Alexander von Humboldt, who captured a rather different way of thinking about climate. For him, place and synthesis and connectedness were all important. His view of climate was much more holistic. In two different ways, climate for him represented the entire atmospheric phenomena of a place at a defined location, but also the whole of climates connected through different locations, a synthesis in space, if you like. And in fact, von Humboldt came up for the first time with the idea of isolines, the idea of drawing lines in space that connected particular temperatures, isotherms, around the world. So, in this early Enlightenment view, as with classical thinkers, climate was anthropocentric. human-centred and relational. Or, of course, we can think of another way of understanding climate, which is here metaphorically in our languages, a description of the prevailing attitudes or conditions. This suggests a more universal or generic understanding of climate that transcends cultures, which has little to do with the weather and a lot to do with culture, shared systems of meaning and social practice. We talk, therefore, of political climates, of economic climates, of moral climates. So, for example, the theologian Michael Northcott, in his book from a decade ago, he wrote a book called A Moral Climate, so a play on the metaphorical use of this idea of climate. But beyond these scientific, historical, and metaphorical uses and definitions, I want just to distill a further way of thinking about the idea of climate, one that I suggest both underlies these other usages, but also helps us to extend it in some other ways as well. It is also, I suggest, a way of thinking about climate which escapes the confines of particular scientific concepts or historical settings, and which we can recognize in many different human cultures. So here I want to approach the idea of climate as a necessary invention for humans. We have to invent the idea of climate to live reliably in the world. So here, climate creates a category which stabilizes our relationships, the relationships between the weather on the one hand, the physical phenomenon that the atmosphere generates and which all sentient beings experience. So it stabilizes the relationship between the weather, which is in constant change and turbulence, and on the other hand, the reflective or patterned ways of living that humans evolve. In other words, culture. So climate, then, in this way of thinking, is an invention to stabilize between these two material and expressive or symbolic ways of living. And here, rather than von Humboldt's relational view of climate, which was between one place and another, or between the physical and the physiological, my view of climate is relational between weather and culture, between the physical atmosphere and the imaginative ways of human living. And it emerges as a necessary invention, I would suggest, for humans, because it's part of this enduring human search for patterns amongst chaos, for order and stability in the world. By having an idea of climate, we can generate a degree of trust in the stability and the viability of human cultural life. Without it, without the idea of climate, the creative human life would become undirected, disorderly, and unstable. The world would be too dangerous and unpredictable a place for us to live safely within. So climate as an idea, then, of the human imagination is an idea in which humans come to place their trust. Indeed, the German sociologist Nico Stehr has written an article talking about trust in climate. And you'll see why this, I think, is very important later on in my talk. Climate becomes an idea, a necessary invention in which we place our trust in order to live culturally. So it is therefore from this particular way of thinking about climate that we get the aphorisms, at least in English. For example, we say climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. Climate offers an ordered container, a linguistic, a numerical, or a sensory repertoire through which the unsettling arbitrariness of restless weather is interpreted and tamed. The historian of science, Lorraine Daston, explains in her essay, which explores the boundaries of nature, she says, without well-founded expectations, the world of causes and promises falls apart. Without well-founded expectations, the climate functions in our imaginative life as a well-founded expectation. It cultivates the possibility of a stable psychological life and of meaningful human action in the world. Climate both identifies a degree of order in the weather, but at the same time an idea which imposes a degree of order on the cultural responses to weather, how we live in particular material environments. Or to put it even more simply, the idea of climate stops the world falling apart. And if we think of it in that way, it helps to explain why the idea of climate change, and I often talk about this now with a hyphen here, climate change, this is a noun, climate change. It explains why climate change is such a powerful yet disturbing idea for us. As with all relations of trust, the thing or the person in which we place our trust can let us down. It's as though our trust in climate is being found wanting. It is letting us down because it is now changing. It is an idea that was invented by us to stabilize relationships, but now that very idea itself is being destabilized. This fear of a world falling apart is a common source of human anxiety. Historian Lucien Boyer he writes about this in his book, Weather in the Imagination. The history of humanity is characterized by an endemic anxiety. It's as if something or someone is remorselessly trying to sabotage the world's driving force, and particularly its climate. Or human anxieties, more recently, about a disorderly climate, are now manifest today in popular descriptions of climatic change as weather weirding or climate chaos. Everything has been thrown up and disturbed. We no longer can trust in this idea of climate. So if climate is this idea which performs these functions of stabilizing relationships between the weather and our cultural life, when physical weather appears to be changing, we need to find new explanations to shore up, to bolster this psychological disorientation that we're experiencing. And this is nicely illustrated in the work of an anthropologist who I've been following, Peter Rudyard-Gould. So Rudyard-Gould, he studied the Marshall Islands and the islanders and their understanding of this phenomenon of climate change. And here when he asked them to explain this, do you believe in climate change? And of course climate change doesn't translate neatly or cleanly at all into Marshallese. So the one respondent here says, well, I think it may be true, because I see that the Maggiotto, which was the closest Marshallese word that could be found, the Maggiotto is not very good nowadays. Life is harder, goods are expensive, the sun is stronger, and there are improper relations between kin. Everything here in this Marshall Islander, the world that they know and understand, has been dislodged, disturbed, unsettled. This is climate change as understood through Marshallese culture. And we can see other comparative examples in other human cultures around the world, particularly that anthropologists have helped us to understand. This unsettling of climate suggests nothing less than an undermining of the possibility of a stable human life. This too is illustrated from another Pacific island context, Solomon Islands here, from the work of anthropologist Edvard Hviding at Bergen University. And in 1989, when he was working in the Solomon Islands, as global messages about the greenhouse effect were beginning to reach places like the Solomon Islands, here an inquisitive, well-educated school teacher expressed his concerns over changes in the weather. The people of old told us how things are. They said that this wind will come at that time and finish after so many moons, and then the other wind will take over. All other things too, tides and rain and all the fish of the sea and whatever, follow this, they said. And so all things have their time. And because the people of old knew how to mark those times, they told us about this, and we believed them, because we could see this with our eyes too. But now, he said, this school teacher, now I don't know. It seems that the weather is not straight anymore. I still would like to trust what people of old taught us, but one day I came to think that maybe they fooled us back then. Maybe things have never been as straight as they would want us to believe. This is exposing this disorientation, this sense of unease. Can I trust the people of old with their idea of climate as a stable description of the physical world? Or do I not trust them? Has something changed now that actually means that I no longer have these reference points that give me any structure or stability to my life? So this is it. This is what I'm interested in, following this idea of climate as an idea with a past and with a future, and as an idea which manifests itself in interesting ways, historically and culturally. It's an idea that performs important functions, not always very obvious functions, in different cultural worlds. And so this, in effect, is what I do in this book, Weathered, Cultures of Climate. It's a historical, geographical exploration of climate as an idea. And I played but deliberately with this idea of weather, weathered, weathering, to weather, as a way of humans, or actually all sentient beings, living in the atmosphere. I examine the ways in which the idea of climate has formed and changed and been used, how climates are believed to be known, the powers that climate exerts over the human imagination, and the ways in which people approach the future possibilities of climate, or keeping the idea of climate under control, which we'll see in a minute, whether that control is through prediction, through climatic redesign, or through new forms of climatic governance. So I just want to give some flavors of some of the illustrative examples that I use here to deepen the way that I think here about climate. So if it can be approached this way, as a stabilizing idea, then we can explore this historically and also culturally today around the world. These cultural histories of climate demonstrate that changes in the conceptual and rhetorical meanings of climate can and do exert a significant influence on public life. These constructed climates, these imaginative climates, have been brought into public life to discipline personal, social, and political behavior in contrasting ways. So I offer some examples here to think this through. Climates change in the imagination as much as they change physically. The example of climate and biopolitics, how we our fears are unleashed around the idea of climate prediction as prophecy, the idea of virtual climates, and then finally the future of the idea of climate. So first example is from the Caribbean. For early modern Europeans, tropical climates were often thought as morally degrading, disease-ridden and deadly. This was true of many 18th century conceptions of the climates of the Caribbean. Many writings from the time emphasized the importance of locality for determining the unhealthiness of tropical climates. A combination of a meridian sun, marshy, rotten soil, heavy rains made it impossible for Europeans to think of Caribbean climates as anything but unhealthy. But changes in commerce, medical knowledge, and especially the rise of international tourism had by the 20th century altered Caribbean climates, in the eyes of most Europeans, to a desirable commodity. Caribbean island climates with sunshine and warmth and predictable dry seasons began to be marketed for foreign consumption. For example, a 1905 hotel brochure from Barbados claimed it was located in the most ideal winter resort of the tropics for tourists, invalids, and those seeking a genial climate. This is from Mark Carey's work. As Carey remarks in his analysis, the warm tropical climate, far from a deadly deterrent, as earlier Europeans thought, was now the Caribbean's best economic asset. So Caribbean climate can be said to have changed dramatically during these 2 centuries, from being deadly and disease-ridden to becoming one of the world's most idyllic tourist havens for sun-starved tourists. Climate changes in the imagination. Climate also has frequently been bound up with narratives of blame. Wars, economic performance, street violence, political despots, famine, property prices, suicides, the age of menstruation, and many more phenomena have all been explained by climate. Culturally credible and persuasive accounts of blame and culpability fulfill an important human political and psychological need. In this sense, the idea of climate enables social institutions to function and societies to be governed. My illustrative example of this comes from the work of Ashwini Tembe, and she was looking at the history of human trafficking. And in the summer of 1921, the first League of Nations Convention on Trafficking met in Geneva, attended by delegates from 34 states. The aim was to ratify the 1910 International Convention for the Suppression of White Slave Traffic. The underlying ambition was to protect girls from trafficking for prostitution, and to do so by establishing a universal age below which practicing prostitution would be illegal. Establishing an international norm for the age of sexual consent at 21 years would allow more traffickers to be prosecuted. But the meetings quickly ran into trouble regarding the very different cultural norms about the ages of consent and legalized marriage, which prevailed in these different nations. A proposal to exempt Eastern countries and tropical colonies from the age standard was rejected. No agreement was reached in Geneva in 1921, and negotiations continued right the way through the 1920s and the 1930s. These discussions about differences in the age of sexual activity focused around the age of first menstruation. Climate, in particular the average temperature of nations, entered the discussions as a useful explanatory force. French, Polish, and Italian delegates used climate as a shorthand to capture differences between the sexual mores of various nations. They argued against a single international standard and instead lobbied to have differences between nations rest on the explanatory variable of climate. And while it was clear to all parties that countries differed in their sexual practices, invoking the idea of climate as controlling the ménage lent a naturalized certitude to these defensive justifications. In the end, this assertion and acceptance of climatically determined differences in the ménage inhibited the League from reaching a consensus. There was no consensus ever reached about this, about the international age of consent, and therefore the goals of the anti-traffickers was thwarted. Climate then here offers a convenient index of national differences in sexual practices, drawing upon the sciences of race which the 19th century had put into circulation. And then my example of fear. Ecological disorder and fear of the unknown are enduring sources of human anxiety. Fearful interpretations of climatic behavior are common throughout human history. These fears are always mediated culturally Climatic fears are bound up in narratives of apocalypse and risk, in emergency narratives and psychological insecurities. Climate chaos exists in the imagination as much as it can be discovered through instrumentation of science and calculation. To take this one example from the front page of one of our national newspapers a number of years ago, a final warning. And here, just to read it, warming seas lead to the possible release of methane hydrates trapped in sub-oceanic sediments. Methane fireballs tear across the sky, causing further warming. The oceans lose their oxygen and turn stagnant, releasing poisonous hydrogen sulfate gas and destroying the ozone layer. Deserts expand almost to the Arctic. Hypercanes, hurricanes of an unimaginable ferocity, circumnavigate the globe, causing flash floods which strip the land of soil. Humanity is reduced to a few survivors eking out living in the polar refuge. Most of life on Earth has been snuffed out. This was the front page of a national daily newspaper. This is apocalypse. This is the revelation of St. John in the Bible on the front pages of our national newspapers. And then climate prediction as prophecy, here now turning to thinking about how the future of climate is bound up in our cultural imaginations. Of course, there's a long history of making claims about the future. Scientific forecasting is only the latest in a long tradition of prophetic knowledge. Predictions of future climate are mediated by a wide variety of cultural norms, computational, excuse me, cultural, my voice is gone. Let's try again. So these predictions of future climate are mediated by cultural norms, computational artifacts, and communicative practices. Computer modelling of the climate is just one means of predicting its future course. Yet model predictions, and those who communicate them, only stand in the long line of prophetic voices. And they face multiple challenges, these prophets. How to be credible, how to carry authority, how to be useful. Thank you. And here I draw upon the work of Linda Walsh, who places climate scientists in the cultural tradition of the prophet. She untangles the confusions and the conflicts which climate predictions and the reports of the IPCC have generated in contemporary societies. At the heart of this confusion is the role and the cultural expectation of the climate scientist. She asks, is their function to reveal the future as surely and accurately as possible, speaking from the stance of scientific disinterestedness and objectivity? Or, on the other hand, is the role of the climate prophet, it's less about a dispassionate unveiling of the future, but more about entering into a public dialogue with what Walsh refers to as that society's covenant values, those values that a polity shares and which distinguishes it from its neighbours. This certainly, she argues, has been the historical function of the prophet. And whilst the first of those might be philosophically attractive, the objectivity and disinterestedness of science, it separates the is from the troublesome ought that David Hume draw our attention to. But it's a rhetorically unstable position for climate scientists to hold. Science advisors are caught in an ethical catch-22. Because if governments call upon the IPCC to predict the future consequences of their actions, when these answers align with the existing ambitions of those governments, scientific advisors are lauded and applauded. But when critics want to challenge those policies, or when the climate predictions misalign with that government's policies, The is-ought boundary is invoked by politicians to undermine the ethos of the scientists. Oh, well, they should not transgress onto that sort of territory. Otherwise, they're undermining their role as scientists. And we saw this maneuver perfectly at work in respect to the ClimateGate affair, which erupted in my university back in 2009, and the various challenges that followed from ClimateGate to the ethos of climate scientists and the IPCC. And as Walsh concludes, until some seemingly more certain epistemology evolves, we will seek our profits amongst the scientists, and they will continue to engage us in a dialogue that goads us to recall our covenant values. Although our science advisors cannot tell the future or tell us what to do, they do and will continue to help us to know ourselves. So I'm moving rapidly through these examples. The penultimate one here is around the idea of virtual climates. And here, new digital visual technologies combined with the idea of data storing capabilities in the cloud are transforming the way that climates are visualized today. Computer animations of the planet using Google Earth are changing the possibilities of how climates, both past and future, are made visual. Through these animations, climate becomes both manufactured and remediated media, in the words of Leon Gurevich. Climate is not just out there to be measured by scientists, or even just in the mind. Climate is now in the machine. Future climates can be visualized and re-engineered so easily through these animating technologies that the feasibility, even the desirability of a future climate-engineered planet now becomes normal. We just turn a few parameters in our model and we re-engineer our climate. The desire for climate control, previously achieved in homes and buildings and cars, now can find consummation in a thermostat-manipulated planet, brought to life, as it were, through Google Earth's digital platforms. So how climate is represented changes the imaginative possibilities of how people invent or live with or alter their climate. And so now, finally, to think about the future of climate briefly, which is where I end my book here. And I take inspiration here from Apprehended's book about the future as cultural fact. Future climate is not simply something to be predicted by scientists. The evolution of the idea of climate is something to be shaped and understood by us, by our imaginations. And I suggest here three ways, different ways of thinking about how the future of climate as being imagined or could be imagined in the future. Three possibilities: resecuring climate, improvised climates, or something I call the post-climate. A resecuring climate, first and most conventionally, I guess, is the idea of climate resecured within certain desirable and safe limits, of eliminating or at least minimizing the effects of human influence on the physical climates of the future. This ambition is trying to shore up the historical function that I started with, of climate as an idea that stabilizes things. We want to re-establish a degree of orderliness and trust in the world in which we live in. The idea of a stable climate as a public good. And here there are four different loci of the transformations which are frequently invoked to bring about this resecuring of climate, whether at 1.5 or 2 degrees or 3 degrees. The governmental, the technological, the social, and the personal, which I won't go into just now. This is the future of climate as resecured. We've brought it back under control. We have re-established that trust that we psychologically need. The second idea is this idea of improvised climates. Improvisation is when one makes it up as one goes along. And the second possibility recognizes the limitations of this impulsive control, and so embraces a future of improvised climates, rather than thinking that we can control or resecure them. Improvisation accepts a more humble disposition with regard to the powers the relative powers of the human and the non-human world. Nevertheless, he recognises the inevitability of purposeful human actions remaking the climate, but only within certain limits of possibility. Physical climates will always exceed precise human management. And this stance of improvisation requires some re-evaluation of the imaginative force of climate as a stabilizing idea. This second option of improvisation has different premises than the first one. Yes, humans have planetary effect through their actions, but nevertheless the physical processes on the planet will always exceed precise human control. And then thirdly, briefly, the idea of the post-climate. This more provocative, perhaps. Here, to think about the future of climate as an idea, climatic change, change which is climatic, no longer has any meaning. There can no longer be change which is merely climatic. Margaret Atwood captures this quite well, the novelist, when she said, I think calling it climate change is rather limiting. I would rather call it everything change. It's about embracing the complexities of change, not just isolating out climate. And so here, if actually we cannot achieve this degree of stability, whether a controlled stability or an improvised stability, given now the reach of humans and the recognition as sort of captured by this pretentious idea of the Anthropocene, maybe the idea of climate has outgrown its purpose. Maybe the human condition no longer has usefulness for this idea of climate as an idea which stabilizes human life. Maybe we have to accept that the new normal is simply that there is no normal. And this is unsettling for us. It goes against this long human cultural history of wanting to stabilize, to impose order, to bring order out of chaos. Maybe we just have to leave that impulse behind. Maybe we need new concepts and metaphorical ideas beyond climate to meet the emotional and spiritual and material demands of living in an atmosphere and with the weather that it generates, which now, without respite, is going to be of human making. And I finish with the words or the ideas of a colleague of mine in the States, Willis Jenkins, an eco-theologian, and in writing about the ethical consequences of deliberately trying to re-engineer the climate of the planet. And he says it's not about the climate that we want, which actually was the refrain that came out of the Earth Summit back in 2012. But actually it's about reflecting on the sort of people that we want to demonstrate that we are. And this ambition, this hubris to control, to master, is perhaps actually revealing something much more deeply about ourselves than it is about the physical phenomena and properties of the climate system. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this incredibly thought-provoking and vast, roaming reflection on climate, and as you put it, climate change with that hyphen, which is now beautifully explained. I think we have some time for questions before we have to get onto a taxi, so I open the floor to students, professors, researchers. Oh my goodness. Okay, starting from the left, and then, yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I was just, I mean, at the end, you actually said that whether instead of climate change, we should call it climate uncertainty, because it seems to me that from a cultural perspective, instead of the fear of change, I mean, change is not necessarily negative, whereas it's more the fear of being uncertain, more we don't know what's happening afterwards. And I just wonder if uncertainty was a big concept in your work. Say something else about that.
Yeah, I think that's a fruitful line of inquiry that would be quite... excuse me, I'm sucking a sweet now to try to get my voice back. But I think, I think it would be quite consistent with the way I'm thinking here, that thinking of climate as an imaginative idea and what sort of cultural functions it's pursuing. And it certainly is linked in with this idea of trust in an interesting way, isn't it? That one wants to trust in something for a degree of security or predictability, whereas actually if that has been taken away from you, then what are you left with? Is one simply just left with a deep uncertainty? And that's a very uncomfortable position to be in, and that's why sort of at the end there I'm saying that if actually climate no longer can function for to generate those sort of properties for us, those psychological and spiritual material needs, we actually need to think it differently. And I think something, around this idea of the Anthropocene, which of course, you can have lots of different conversations about what it signifies, but it is telling us something about the future. And I think it is linked in here to these instincts for control, for stability, and therefore the corollary of that, which is the uncertainty.
I had a question. Yes?
I want that you comment on that you maybe comment in spite of the strong knowledge. In spite of the strong knowledge in terms of physics and social. In the scientific community, we continue to have a large gap between decisions, political decisions in terms of government, and this knowledge that we see in scientific world.
Yes, so I'm paraphrasing your comment or your question. What value then does scientific knowledge about the physical climate system as described at the beginning of my talk, how the IPCC would approach it? Am I saying that actually scientific knowledge about the physical system is irrelevant or doesn't matter? No, I don't think I'm saying that. But I think what I'm saying is that the sort of questions that climate change, the science of climate change has thrown up at us are actually questions that scientific knowledge on its own are quite incapable of giving us answers to. Because these questions are not simply about sort of very precise engineering questions about how a physical system changes. They're actually questions about how humans live with each other, live with a non-human, live with the future. And how humans live is not a question that science, I don't believe, is equipped to answer. They're questions that have to come out of our more reflective sciences, if you will, the humanities, of how we think and imagine and believe and value. And those are things beyond the reach of science. And so the narrow, that's sort of why the Paris Agreement, it's problematic in many respects. It lays out this ambition of 2 degrees, maybe 1.5 degrees of containment, but actually doesn't really get to grips with all of the different human, ethical, justice dimensions of how one might get there. And actually, in the end, that is what politics needs to grapple with, not simply the mechanics of, what you do with a certain tonnage of carbon in the atmosphere.
I had a question here, then I have there, and then yes, Simone.
Thank you so much. I have two questions, in fact. One more theoretical, one more normative. I'll be fast. First, this take on climate is quite based on reflexivity, it's very human, so to speak. But climate has a similar function also for other species that we don't think are reflexive. And can you imagine extending this approach outside the boundary of human nature, and can the approach towards ecology maybe help to this endeavor? And second, normative question. As a planner, I think that envisioning future is useful to decide where to go. So the question will be, where do you think we should go? Because, I mean, in some places in the world it's easier to speculate. In other places of the world, climate change is much more unsettling, so to speak.
Okay, very good questions, both of which I think, in the way I'm thinking here that I've outlined today, I need to do a lot more work on. The non-human, I think, as I mentioned, yes, all sentient beings in a sense have this, all sentient beings sort of indwell this relationship between the physical properties of the weather or the environment more broadly and their ways of life. I mean, non-human beings have cultural ways of living as well. And I think the interesting question there is about the different responses of non-humans to different physical stimuli, and how humans have reduced or limited, or possibly on the other hand, humans actually in the future could open up new possibilities of adaptation. I'm thinking here about physiological adaptation. And it comes back to your second question, I guess, which is about vision, future vision. What sort of future vision actually should be guiding or inspiring us? And we have quite radical visions at work around climate change. Some that are very technologically rich and heavy, where actually the idea of physiological adaptations, deliberate or semi-engineered by humans, is part of that whole story. On the other hand, you can retreat back into a sort of a decivilized, like the Dark Mountain Project has argued for. We have to decivilize before we can find ourselves again. But I think this is exactly the level at which one has to tackle the questions that climate change raises. That these are not technical questions; these are questions of the human imagination. And I'm not in the position to lay out what I think the right vision is, but I'm wanting the conversation to be occurring at that level of discourse, and not limiting climate change to simply a number or a set of technical equations or even a set of particular technologies.
Manuela. Sorry, I'm giving you no break to breathe, but there are so many questions.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. And I was wondering about not cultures of climate, but about cultures of weather, because I know that in Portuguese and in French, and I suppose also in Spanish, weather and time is the same noun, tempo, le temps. Have you ever think about those kind of cultural reasons? Because in French, in Portugal, we have also
It's okay, just project the board. Project.
or season, so changing the type of time
Yes.
during the year. So why is that in England weather so much important compared to the southern countries of Europe?
Yes. No, that's a great observation, of course, and this issue of actually how different linguistic cultures have imposed a degree of understanding on the world through language is really quite fascinating. And of course, this connection between time and weather, tiempo, is not evident, it's not self-evident in English. And it sort of, in a way, has been erased by, again, a certain scientific rationalism of thinking of time in a very linear way. So one of my PhD students, he's been working in northern Thailand, he's Thai, and he's been working in northern Thailand to understand what weather and climate change means to rice farmers in the hills of northern Thailand. So people who are well away from the centres of calculative power and scientific rationality. And he lived as a rice farmer for 12 months with these farmers to understand how their weather is actually understood, and it's deeply built up and understood through their agricultural cycle. In fact, they have 3 seasons, but those seasons are cyclical and they're recurrent, and the weather therefore follows that same rhythm, those same patterns. And all the attachments they have to weather and climate change are linked to different forms of cultural ritual, linked to the harvest, or to the planting. And then what he then studied was, well, what happens then when these rice farmers are exposed to outside NGOs or government officials or agencies who bring in this discourse of climate change? And what we were interested in is this tension, this clash, this disconnect between these different knowledges, and who actually carries the power in that sort of encounter. So I think notions of how weather is appreciated in different cultures is very, very rich, and it doesn't always sit easily with a certain scientific approach to how we think climate or weather performs.
I need to go this way. There were other, yes. Okay, first bit lady behind, and then gentleman in the front.
Then I might try to project my voice as well.
Or you can try that technology, but
Okay.
we are all in favor of human capacities.
Okay? Yes. Too much. Hello. My name is Paula Castro, and I'm a social psychologist. Thank you. This was really interesting. And my question comes in a nice moment because I spent my last 10 years interviewing farmers and fishers due to climate change related issues. So I was thinking of asking you whether you agree that climate change has offered us in the last years, in the last decades, an important experiment on global governance, on how to organize a global governance that is mostly based on science. And my question would be, would you agree that this organization of governance and science is what is narrowing the imaginations for the future? And if it has always to happen like this, when you are trying to govern on a global scale, is it always necessary to narrow, standardize imaginations for possible futures? Also, this is the first part, and the last part of the question is whether if you think that local knowledges can play a role in the opening up of the possible imaginations for the future in this field.
Okay, again, I can't possibly do justice to both of those dimensions of the question. But I think there is something to be said about how global climate, has emerged as a new object of governance, and it emerged at a particular moment of time in the late 1980s, early 1990s, which was, now with the benefit of at least a little bit of hindsight, was a very particular moment in geopolitical history when there was a degree of rising optimism around the new international world order, the collapse of the bipolar world, and we actually saw various manifestations beginning to take shape, including the ozone layer, which was one that was tackled, and actually a lot of the machinery of governing the ozone layer was imported into trying to govern climate, thinking that actually climate change was another of these types of issues. Actually, for me, climate change is a radically different type of issue to stratospheric ozone. And to imagine that one can establish institutions of global governance of climate by reducing the object. So for the ozone, what you're trying to govern is actually the density of stratospheric ozone that protects us from dangerous ultraviolet radiation. In the case of climate, you're trying to govern global temperature, or actually connected to that is carbon. And so what's now emerged is that new forms of governance around global climate are actually forms of governing carbon-generating activities. And in fact, Harriet Bulkley has written probably most persuasively or insightfully about what this does, because all forms of human activity then are reduced to their carbon content. And so new instruments of global climate governance are actually imposing very particular ways of regulating and disciplining social life through the lens of carbon. And that itself is a very reductive way of thinking. It's governing human life through carbon accounting. On the local knowledge, yes, I think this is exactly what I would be arguing for. That the different experiences that people have of their environments are deeply shaped in their historical and cultural legacies. And also we have these new different cultural resources to work with as well, that there is not just one way of seeing the world. So we talk about biodiversity, in terms of preservation and protecting of biodiversity. We need to talk about cultural diversity, ontological diversity, as Anne Salmond in New Zealand talks about. These are things that we need to preserve because they actually give us more space for manoeuvring, rather than simply reducing the world to one particular metric or one particular paradigm. So mobilizing these, I think, is very important. The IPCC has not done a very good job at recognizing this. And we know that it's difficult, but I do think it's important to keep the pressure on, which I know, there are networks that are trying to do that.
Okay, I have one question here, then it's Paolo, and then I come back to Paula. Anyone
Hello.
else?
Hello, my name is Bishwajit Roy. I'm from Bangladesh and I'm a PhD student of ICS. My question is related to the local knowledge. During your presentation you were saying that it's in some kind of somewhere in island the people are doubting about the knowledge about calming the rain and all these things, rise of temperature, stuff like this. So do you think that the people of our generation will rely on this local knowledge in future to cope with this climate change? This is the first one. And there are a lot of argument regarding this contradiction between the local knowledge, that indigenous knowledge, and the science. And how will you define it? That's it.
Well, there are different levels I could answer that question. I mean, one level of answering the question is that all knowledge is local. I mean, whether it's scientific knowledge, or social scientific knowledge, or humanistic knowledge, or what we call indigenous or lay knowledge, all knowledge is actually place-based. And certainly science studies scholars of the last 2 or 3 decades have shown that very much the case with science. Science is actually always located. Certain knowledges in science emerge out of particular epistemic cultures or material infrastructures, particular laboratories, particular experimentations. One of my PhD students did their PhD on the way in which climate models, which for many, of course, are the epitome of universal global knowledge about the climate system, but climate models emerge in very particular laboratory settings, probably in only no more than 10 countries in the world, with very particular patronage from governments and from funding bodies. And the circulation of experts through these modelling laboratories creates a cohort of expertise that is highly place-based. So you can see scientific knowledge in the same way as local knowledge as being local. So that's one way of thinking about these different categories. And of course also I think we should recognize that knowledges are always in flux. So we talk about the categories local knowledge and scientific knowledge. And we tend to think of local knowledge as being rural. But actually, as more and more of our lives and more people live in urban environments and urban settings, there's another interesting category of knowledge to emerge, to be invented, that isn't rural or sort of the knowledge of nostalgic sort of historical cultures that have not been exposed to forces of urbanization. But how do us as urban dwellers, what sort of knowledge do we have of our weather or our local environment? That is going to be local knowledge as well, but very different from the local knowledge that Thai rice farmers or Inuit fishers will generate. So I think diversifying the range of knowledges that are at work in the world, I think, is a part of the project as well, and not simply having very rigid categories.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the content of your presentation. You rooted your notion of climate in the idea that we can find in many other areas of social life, that uncertainty is unbearable. And in a way you presented the climate to us as a version of those things that in my much more modest work used to call systems for domestication of uncertainty, which we can find in almost whole areas where uncertainty is relevant for human life. And I will say that one more example that you're right is that the notion of deterministic chaos, which both recognize uncertainty and try to put an order in it, just was born in climatology. But my question is, if uncertainty is so structurally unbearable for humans in all kind of areas, does it make much sense besides an academic hypothesis to put, like in the end of your presentation, the possibility that we overpass that in one of the many areas where we see that? And that brings me a new question that is more about your view on those issues than in what you present. Do you think it will be worth it to make an effort, starting, for instance, with your work, to try to make some common sense between the climate, as you put it, I will say, as a system to domesticate uncertainty, and other examples that are studied elsewhere by other colleagues, and make maybe a group, a research group, to explore that line of research?
Well, thank you. That's very interesting. That formulation was not one that I'm familiar with. Is this out of anthropology or sociology? The anthropologists, okay, so systems of domestication of uncertainty. So I guess exactly that is the claim I'm making, and it may not be particularly new to scholars of a certain set of traditions. I guess for most people certainly most scientists, or even most social scientists who engage with climate, they may not have quite have thought of it in that way. So I think there is a value in trying to explain or to unveil or to reveal what actually are the deeper reasons why climate change is such an unsettling idea, rather than simply it's a you know, it's not one of those categories of environmental problems that have emerged in the last 50 years. You know, asbestos in buildings or mercury pollution in rivers that can simply be reverse engineered back out again. Actually, no, there's something much deeper here that is at work. And I think there's a value in exposing what those deeper human psychological concerns are. And I think I'd be very interested to see how in other forms of human cultural living this idea of uncertainty has been tamed or sought to be tamed in different settings, and to see whether there's a nice synergy between what I see in climate and these other systems. I suppose the other part of your question, though, is, well, what? So if we've dismantled one system of uncertainty domestication, which is climate, we've dismantled that. It's no longer, it doesn't function as a system for domesticating uncertainty. What do we put in its place? Which I think is the other part of your question. And again, I'm back here to finding other ways of meeting these same needs of humans. And we may have to look in different places. And again, this challenges, I think, a certain Enlightenment tradition of knowledge making, which was, you know, that the ascendant progress of greater and greater knowledge would bring greater abilities of humans to control and to bring security into their world. And that myth, in an anthropological sense, a myth, you know, is losing its power. And so we actually need new myths that can replace that, to meet those particular psychological and spiritual needs that humans have.
I keep writing up my questions for you, but I can't ask them. So the last question is for Carla. And then we have to wrap up, I'm sorry. But maybe can we persuade you to join us at the bar, and then anybody who wants to join us can have it.
There's a coffee in the corridor.
There's a coffee in the corridor. You can't even sit down. I'm so terribly sorry. Carla.
Over all these years you have been looking to climate, and over this some 30 years that it has been growing as a very political issue. I understand that your own approach has changed a lot, your way of communicating about climate change, and also you have been pretty critical about some, you showed some examples from the media, for instance, pretty critical about the sensationalist way of communicating about climate change. But at the same time, you're not just gathering data and doing research, you're really engaging with all this political dialogue, and you publish a lot for a wider public. So what I wanted to ask is, how do you feel yourself? How do you see yourself and your role? Is your role to be raising awareness about climate change? Is it something else? And if it's raising awareness, what is your main target? Is citizens, policymakers, is scientists themselves?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, that's again a good question that forces me to have to reflect on the different roles. And I mean, the roles I've seen over my 30 years have been very different. In the first few years, back in the 1980s, the 1990s, when I started working on this, I would have seen my public roles very much as a science communicator, you know, following the linear model of science communication, the deficit model of well, we need our people to understand, because there's a deficiency in their understanding. And that was in the 1990s. I think then gradually I saw my role changing, and the sort of the networks of interactions that I had brought me more in the context of adaptation, actually both in public and private sector adaptation, thinking about scenarios. This is a lot of work I did on climate scenarios and decision making. And but that in itself actually brought about a change, because rather than thinking, well, decision makers need climate scenarios, we're back to the prediction of the future to help them make good decisions, what I realized at the end of that cycle was actually decision makers may not actually need climate predictions at all. And actually it's completely turning this around. What actually are the constraints on making good decisions? And it may well not be climate at all as relevant, because many other factors completely swamp the importance of climate when making good decisions about the future. And of course uncertainty comes into play there as well. More recently, I would say my role is different again. I've come back more into an educational setting. I teach a large number of students, and for me my role there is to provoke and to unsettle solidified assumptions that students have. If they think they know what climate change is, I'm there to persuade them that they don't. That actually climate change escapes all of our abilities to understand what it is about. And so in the classroom, that's what I'm seeking to do with my students, so that in effect they take ownership of what climate change is for them. More broadly, I still do a lot of public speaking, and I guess it's trying to, as some of the questions here have suggested, it's trying to, first of all, recognize that there are different knowledges in play, that we shouldn't simply defer to the climate scientists because they're a climate scientist. There are other valid and valuable knowledges that need circulating. And this is a political project, because it's emancipatory. It actually is a way of empowering different people. It's empowering citizens, it's empowering people in non-scientific settings to recognize that their knowledge counts. And so that, in the wider sense, I suppose, is my bigger political project. It's not trying to, I don't lobby politicians to sign up to particular treaties, or I don't go around signing petitions. I'm not a member of a social activist network, but I see my role is a different role, which is an emancipatory and empowering role around the deep questions that climate change raises. This is not simply a question of technoscience. This is a question, as someone said before, about what sort of vision, what sort of future, or the quote I offered from my colleague Willis Jenkins, what sort of people are we trying to demonstrate that we are when dealing with climate change? Are we trying to demonstrate that we're people who care about what? Care about the future, care about the non-human, care about the consequences of our actions in less privileged places? Are we demonstrating that we're people who think that we can master the universe? Is that who we really think we are? So different roles at different stages in my career.
Well, that was a perfect question to end, I have to say, because it gave us another opportunity to understand the next steps of your journey since we started, and it's been a real pleasure to have you. I think the number of questions demonstrates that you have raised many more questions than we could ask and answer at this stage. I have my list, I'll send it to you. But I want to have another round of applause to thank Mike for a long talk and a long set of Q&A. Thank you.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you, that was...
Great.